When extending this invitation, we made it clear, or at least we hope we did, that you, by participating, help us in the completion of a project that has been funded by the Ford Foundation. If you are not clear that this event is being videotaped, please know that now, and that we welcome your perspectives, your comments as we go forward. The context for today's discussion, what we've called a Capitol Hill Roundtable, is that in 2010, Excelencia in Education launched a national initiative called Ensuring America's Future by Increasing Latino College Completion. We did this very purposefully linking Excelencia in Education's mission of accelerating Latino student success in higher education with the focus by selected national funders and political leaders on Latino higher educational success. The results, Ensuring America's Future, underscores that for the U.S. to regain the top ranking in the world for college degree attainment, Latinos will need to earn 5.5 million more degrees by 2020. Over the last 4 years, Excelencia in Education and our partners have advanced a tactical plan and the use of practical analysis to support the necessary changes on campuses and in communities across this country to increase Latino college completion. Today, we begin the effort in 2015. Ensuring America's Future takes another step in this process and uses state data and the national context to focus on actions and policies that address this critical need to increase Latino higher educational attainment and to meet the country's civic and workforce needs. We are delighted that in taking this step, we are partnering with long-standing leaders in the state of California and in the state of Colorado. We are looking at analysis which is focused on the question of helping or hindering state policies and Latino college completion. I would like to introduce the 3 speakers who will be the backbone of our roundtable. Following their comments, we will do a little bit of question and answer across the panel, and then we will open it up to you. The first speaker is Deborah Santiago. She is the co-founder of Excelencia in Education. She functions as our COO and Vice President for Policy, and it is really her role in framing this discussion about a tactical plan and the strategies that will advance success. She will be followed by Audrey Dow, Vice President, External Affairs and Operations for the Campaign for College Opportunity in the state of California. And following her will be Luis Torres, Deputy Provost at Metropolitan State University in Denver and a member of the Colorado Coalition for the Educational Advancement of Latinos, known by many as COSIL in the state of Colorado. With this, I'd like to turn things over to Deborah Santiago.
Buenos días. Buenos días. Now we're talking. Okay. I know it's a kind of a dark room, but that doesn't mean our conversation has to be less than rigorous. If you don't mind, I'm going to stay seated. I thought about sitting up there, but I think you can all see me. Can you hear me all right back there? Okay. So you have in front of you something we put together, kind of a summary for discussion. We focus a lot of our work in Excelencia and Education in data and translation of data to inform and compel policy and practice. And for us, it's all about scale, because what we know works with individual students is one-on-one advising and support. But at the level we work here in DC, it's about making sure that thousands and every student through policy and practice gets served in ways that make a difference. We released last year state fact sheets on Latino college completion. And our reason for doing that, in part, was because we found, even in this day and age, 2014, 2015 now, that there's still a profound ignorance about our Latino population, right? And the assumptions of the opportunities that are there and serving us need to be framed in a manner that show what's possible and what more we can do to serve our population well. So we started with data. For us, that's summarily important, and if you've not seen that, I encourage you to do so. We did it for each of the 50 states and national level. The reason I raise that is because as an organization, we're also very aware that data are only as good as they're used. It's not the first time these data have come out. They're not unique. But it's how you frame the data and how you use it to inform and compel action that really matters. And so we wanted to complement the data and the clarity about what's happening in states by taking a look at state policy. Because while the data are there, it's really what are we doing at a level that matters and scale that's going to serve our students well. And is it informed by data or not? And those of you that work in public policy know those are not always the same thing. They're not always linked. So what we tried to do was to work in 3 states that we have long-standing partnerships. Because as an organization, a national organization, we take a look at the landscape. We are very focused on what's working, what's making a difference, the institutions that are doing that. But at the end of the day, we acknowledge that we don't carry the water within states. We try to create space and opportunity and bring attention to and compel. But it is our partners at the state level that are really making a difference, that are really compelling the strategies that make a difference for our students. So this piece you have here was our attempt to look at existing public policy at the state level. And most of you know, state policy drives the bulk of the work and the impact for our students. Federal and national policy is summarily important, but it's state policy that really drives the difference for many of our students today. And they should be aligned, and they should have the same goals, and they should have an impact. But I think we can all agree that that doesn't always happen. So our attempt here is to bring some awareness in our assessment using a Latino lens. And again, that's not to negate any other student, but saying if we start with the Latino population and see how these policies can help hinder their progress, or whether we need to reconsider what it is that's going on, maybe by looking at this population and starting with them, it can allow us to address educational issues that seem intractable in different ways. And ultimately, that would serve all of our students better, because I think a lot of our focus is paying attention to Latinos as kind of these post-traditional students. These are not the students that we focus on predominantly in public policy. And I've been guilty of that as a policy wonk in DC, right? These traditional students, that 18-year-old that goes straight from high school to college, lives on campus, finishes in 4 years. That's not the norm. In fact, less than 20% of students today fit that traditional profile. And their pathway isn't that way. But that seems to be what we focus on in public policy. And so checking that with the policy of today and saying what more can we do when we look at a post-traditional profile and a Latino profile, what are the opportunities we have to really serve our students well? That's what we want to have an engaged discussion about. And that's too often or too little of the focus we have in education today. So let me give you, for those of you that didn't take a look and internalize and memorize our state fact sheets in Latino College Completion, let me just give you a little bit of data, and purposely didn't do PowerPoint because this is more about the policy part, but we believe they're intrinsically linked. And in each of those fact sheets, we saw clear gaps in educational attainment, okay? And for those of you that work in education, that's not a complete surprise. For us, we frame that as an opportunity to invest and make a difference, and not so much a crisis that we have to figure out, but what can we do about it? So in the 3 states we focused on where we have partners, and 2 of them are here, Texas is the other. I'm going to share a little bit about that too. Unfortunately, our colleagues from Texas, Educate Texas, weren't able to join us, but they're with us, and they'll be with us as we continue the work going forward. Let me just share with you the core data that should compel us to want to do more in public policy. So I'll start with the fact that when you look at the 3 states, California, Colorado, and Texas, these 3 states alone house over half of the Latinos in education today. These states matter at the national level, and we should be paying attention to what is and isn't happening, what's helping and hindering our students from making progress. If nothing else, that is an important data point to consider. But then we look at K-12, because as you all know, if college completion is the end goal, it's predicated on what happens in K-12 and before, even early childhood education. And we focus on the end goal, but we know everything is through there. So in K-12 education, California and Texas, Latinos are 50%. 1 in 2 students in those 2 states are Latino. Anything that happens in K-12 policy affects Latinos in those states. In Colorado, it's 30% that are in K-12. That's significant. I'm going to pass over, but I will say this. The median age of students of our communities in those 3 states is 27. It's like the national average, compared to 42 for white non-Hispanics. Think about the opportunity that we have in addressing state policy when we are such a young part of the population in those states. And then the educational attainment gaps. They're real. In California, there's a 22% gap in Latino adults versus all adults in the state of California that have an associate degree or higher. And we did go down to associate. Baccalaureate, it's even worse, to be honest with you. In Colorado, a 26% equity gap in degree attainment. And in Texas, a 16% gap between Latino adults and others. Those are significant gaps, given that we just shared the importance of the population there, okay? So how do we address that now that we know? So let me give you a couple of things that we paid attention to in assessing state policy and see if you all agree with it, or there are things that we might have missed, and hopefully that sets the tone for my colleagues talking a little bit more specifically about what they're doing to leverage their efforts. So we've got this gap. We took a look at the following indicators of data to show. So what does college preparation look like for our students? What does college readiness look like for our students? They're not the same. There are data that can give us different components of that, right? College going. What does college going look like in each of these 3 states? What does their enrollment look like? Are there transfer numbers? Their persistence in college? The capacity of institutions to serve them? What about their their attendance intensity, part-time, full-time? These are things that public policy might be able to address and should be addressing. Those that are returning adult students, what does institutional funding look like? What is the remediation status and policies? What are those policies looking like, and are they serving our population? And what does affordability look like in these states? And then the last is completion. And we showed you the equity gap. But all of these are critical components and factors in understanding what is state policy doing that is either helping, hindering our population, or that we need to reconsider with more of a Latino lens than has been looked at in the past. And I'll tell you, this is not an easy conversation in many of these states. Even with our partners here, people are not comfortable talking about race and ethnicity, right? I mean, we are here in this room, but conversations in public policy are not easily had with a focus on race ethnicity. Too often we hear, or not too often, but often we hear, we're educating all of our students. And that's not a bad goal to have. But we would posit to you, if we were effectively educating all of our students, we wouldn't have attainment gaps. So let's be frank. What's the role of public policy is to try and address that in some significant way. At least that's how we frame it. And if you've got a challenge or you don't think that's the case, I would love to hear that. But we can't, it's disingenuous to say we're educating all without acknowledging that there are gaps in attainment. All right, so let me get into a couple of the policies that we articulated and then hand it on to my colleagues. Hopefully this is a little bit provocative to have our conversation that we'd like you to engage in with us. And as I said, we've got this piece, we just gave you the highlights. The entire brief will have more of a breakdown in detail about each of the states and each of the policies we put in here. And if we're missing a policy you think is relevant, we'd love to hear that. If you want to challenge whether something is a help or a hindrance, we'd love to hear that as well. I mean, part of this is really to engage in a more critical policy discussion about what we need to be doing. And we fully acknowledge that we have to do it in partnership with others who are carrying the water day in and day out, and you all are part of that. Okay, so in California, given the parameters I raised, the indicators, looking at policies, state policies that help. I'm not going to go into the specifics of it because I'm going to leave some of that to you. But I'll tell you, in the areas of policy that help address Latino college completion, and again, the goal is completion, college preparation, there are policies on college prep that can help, that are helping in some ways with students and what's going on. We know that there are specific requirements about what's college ready. They've articulated what those curricula should be. In some ways, we can also talk about a hindrance in not setting clear pathways to a quality education as transparently as the expectations for college prep. But I don't want to negate that there are state policies that are addressing what college readiness means and what our students need to get there. And we have data on Latinos and how they're performing. But support for community college students and their support services, I should say, for community college students. So important when you have institutions with limited resources that have a high concentration of Latino students. And they're low cost, but it often comes at the expense of the support services for the very students who need it the most. And honestly, in many ways, they cost the most to educate because they need academic support, they need financial aid, and they're at institutions that have very low resources. So looking at state policy that addresses student support services for students at community colleges is really an important public policy issue. Two more that are helping, looking at transfer policy. That's something that actually the campaign was very instrumental in. I'll let you talk about that. But if we have so many students in community colleges in California, are we helping them transition to four-year programs or not? Especially if that was their goal. And is there a state role, is there a public policy role at states to make sure that institutions and educators are doing right by the students who intend to transfer? And so that is in place. Now, the data might reflect a little bit differently, but this is another issue. And then we are looking at all of the states. The issue of dreamers and undocumented students is a salient public policy issue, given where they are in location. So looking at the fact that each of these states has on the books in-state tuition policies for these students, and some of them even offer financial aid. In fact, all three of them do, is an important component that we don't want to address. Now, while undocumented students are a very small proportion of Latino students nationally, it still doesn't negate the importance of addressing it from a public policy perspective to ensure they get the quality education they deserve like the other students who are there. So those are those that help. I think I need to go a little bit faster. So I think what I'm going to do is, I could talk for quite a long time of how we try to do this, but let me just, I'm not going to talk too much about Texas. Anybody here from Texas? Important work going on there, but I'm going to cede my time, and maybe you can ask me to that. But programs that hinder, policies that hinder in California, and some of these are consistent with Colorado as well. So I'm going to pull the ones that are consistent there. In California, there is not a centralized database of information on students and their performance, so that those that care about public policy and want to aggregate what those data are so they can more in a timely manner address policy, it doesn't exist in a manner that's helpful. We are dealing with decreased funding levels, and that is a state policy issue. It's not just what you have in the books, it's what you fund. And there are real capacity constraints in California, and making sure there are seats available for every student, but also there are courses available. Because when you have opportunities to enroll students and then they can't take the courses they need to graduate in a timely manner, it's almost a disservice to those students. And we see that in California when you look at the data that support these policies overall. And then I guess the last thing I would say that's consistent with California and Colorado, and to a certain extent in Texas as well, is that there's lack of support for race-conscious efforts. And some of this was overtly mandated in state policy. And other areas, it speaks back to the point we were saying that people aren't always comfortable talking about race ethnicity and rather go under the auspice of educating all rather than delineating. And that can really be a challenge when you're trying to ferret out with limited resources and attention. How do you target those resources in the most effective way to get the goals you'd like? And if you can't target in a meaningful way or use that as one among many variables, what does that do to your ability to target public policy to have an impact? So I think those are the biggest ones. The others that I would say are of core attention, or that we need to re-examine for both of these states, and actually for California, for Texas as well, is we have to pay attention to remedial education and the redesign that needs to happen. We're looking at data in these three states that show there is a real gap in what's happening in public policy to support our students. And to just say, let's push it down to the community college level, let's push it to other places so we don't have to deal with it, doesn't negate that, over a third of all of our students need remediation. And addressing that is critical to college completion, not just enrollment. And that's the case in all 3 states. And then I do think that the college preparation issue is in there for all 3 of them as well. So I hope I just gave you, I know I just touched upon them quickly, but I'm gonna leave to our colleagues to get a little bit more specific and see if we can get into a discussion. Audrey?
Thank you, Deborah. It's so nice to be here with all of you. I'm Audrey Dow. I'm the Vice President of External Affairs and Operations for the Campaign for College Opportunity, and it's always a pleasure to be working with Excelencia. We've partnered on so many research projects together, policy initiatives together, and I think what we're most grateful for is that Excelencia continues to be so intentional about specifying the need to have Latino educational attainment improve, and why it's a national imperative for all of us and for all of our states. The campaign's a 10-year-old policy and advocacy organization based out of California that really fights to make policy changes that allow more California students to go to college. We were founded by an unlikely alliance. We were founded by the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, MALDEF, the California Business Roundtable, which represents our largest businesses in the state, and the Community College League of California, which represents the presidents and trustees of our 112 community colleges in the state. And those unlikely allies, along with our 2 co-founders, which were retired Jewish baby boomers, came together really because California was turning its back on its historic plan of a spot in college for every eligible student in the state. I'm sure most of you have heard of California's golden, 1960 master plan for higher education, and it's something that's very important to the state and really set up our 3 systems of higher education, our community colleges, our CSU system, and our UC system. But what started happening a little over 10 years ago was that California just didn't have the space to serve new students. And this was happening at precisely the same time that the economy was demanding a more educated worker, and at precisely the same time that demographic shifts were happening. So what was once promised to a generation, what was once a guaranteed promise of college opportunity to 2 generations ago was no longer a promise for the students that are coming through the pipeline today. So the organization was founded and was really to bring another voice to the state capitol. The players in Sacramento tended to be the institutions themselves, labor representing those institutions, but rarely did you hear a voice coming from a civil rights, business, even student perspective in the Capitol to talk about the importance of higher education to all of these communities. We focus a lot on ensuring greater completion, making sure there's access for students in California from an economic perspective, but also from an equity perspective. And when we talk about equity in California, there is no way of getting around the fact that we have such a large Latino population in our state. And as Deborah shared those numbers, right now we have about 39% of adults in the state of California are Latino, and 1 in every 2 children in the state of California under the age of 18 is Latino. We're facing as a state a serious workforce shortage crisis that's looming. We're predicted by 2025 to be 2.3 million baccalaureate degrees and associate degree and certificate holders short from what our economy needs to be successful. And there is no way California can close that gap without increasing the educational attainment of Latinos. And when we look at our numbers in California, we only have 11% of Latinos that are adults having a bachelor's degree, and we only have 5% of Latino adults with an associate degree. So clearly, there is a lot of room for improvement. A little bit about what the campaign's doing about it, as Deborah shared, we really fought hard for several years to introduce statewide legislation that would fundamentally overhaul the transfer system in California's community colleges, between community colleges and our Cal State University system, which is the #1 transfer destination for students. Quite frankly, it was a complete maze for students to go from one of the 112 colleges to one of our 23 CSU campuses, just an utter maze. We randomly had an intern in our office who shared with us, one day she just came in looking so tired, And it was because she shared that she was going over the course of 4 days to 7 or 8 different community college campuses to get the requirements to be able to transfer to one CSU campuses. Her day started at 4 in the morning and ended about 11 o'clock at night. That's not including that she was trying to be a competitive candidate for the CSU system, so she was working, and she had an internship with us. That's not a unique story in California. That's very, very common, and we knew something needed to be done. So we worked very, very hard to reform the way students transfer. We said, we know that students who do transfer in very popular majors. We can identify what those majors are. There are about 25 of them in California that exist. Couldn't we make streamlined pathways to those 25 majors so that wherever a student goes in any of the 112 colleges, the curriculum's the same, and all the CSUs, regardless of which one you're applying to, would accept that pathway and accept those students. And so we were able to pass a bill called SB 1440, which became the Student Transfer Reform Act. And not only does it create a streamlined pathway, this legislation created a streamlined pathway for students, it also guaranteed that when a student took this pathway, that before they transferred, they'd actually earn an AA degree. So many students were transferring onto the four-year universities without that AA on their resume. And we all know that if students continue to work, having an AA on your resume means that you have a little more wiggle room to negotiate your salary. If a student didn't complete the four-year degree, at least they'd have something to show for that time and effort and rigorous curriculum they took at the community college level. So having that AA was really important. And then when students take this pathway, they're guaranteed to do this pathway in 60 units, which is just unheard of, right? Students are graduating on average with 80 units at the community college level, well more than they need to get an associate degree and transfer. And then once they're at the CSU side, they're guaranteed admission to the CSU, and then it's 60 more units before they complete. These students also receive a bump in GPA for what we call in California impacted CSU campuses and impacted CSU majors. That's when there is a huge demand for these campuses or majors, and the colleges are given, or the universities are given, the flexibility to up the requirements for admissions into their programs. So this gives students on the pathway a GPA bump for majors and campuses that are impacted. So it's a really good deal. I'm so proud to share that in just real 2 years of being operational on the ground and having these degrees available, we have about 11,000 students that were conferred with associate degrees for transfer last year. That number we hope continues to grow, but there is a lot of work that we will continue to do to make sure that this is implemented. I think for us, what we don't want to see is that community colleges that have always done well by students continue to be the ones that do well under this new policy. The idea was that we would level the playing field for all students, regardless of where they were at community colleges. And so we stand committed to that goal, that every student, regardless of where they are in our state and what community college they're at, that they have access to these new degrees and that they're actually being marketed and that students know how to take them, they get into them, and they transfer successfully on time and with all the guarantees that they're given. We've also been a part of something called an equity scorecard for our community colleges. As Deborah shared, data is not readily available in California anymore. We don't have a coordinating body or coordinating entity for all of our higher education systems. And so it was really important to us that community colleges start to report out on how their students are doing by race and ethnicity in terms of progression and completion. And so for the first time ever, we have very public scorecards for all of our community colleges. You can go to the chancellor's website, and the data is there for you to look up and see how colleges are doing. On the one hand, this is a great tool for families and students as they're looking to go to college and choose where they might be most successful. But I think it's even more important, and it's our hope, that this is really a tool used by the institutions themselves. to give them that baseline data if maybe they're not looking at their data or they don't have an institutional research arm, that this is baseline data that they can start to look at, form teams around so that they can start drilling down on why are our numbers looking like this, where are the areas for improvement, and how might we as educators and as the institution really figure out how we close the gaps that are persisting. This year in 2015, the Campaign for College Opportunity is going to be very, very focused, as we have been for the last year, at getting California to adopt a statewide plan for higher education. While our master plan for higher education really set forth really the missions of each of our segments for higher education, it never kind of completed the story of what and who we need to come out of our systems and how we make sure we educate all students in all seats. So 33 other states in the country have plans for higher education with real targets for how many degrees we should have, targets by which we're going to close equity gaps, strategies for reaching the differing regions in states, and California has been glaringly missing from that conversation. And it really is our intention to make sure that California gets back on track and puts down some commitments that then can help us align limited resources that are still limited going out to our institutions of higher education. We're going to do some work this year around improving remediation. 85% of Latinos who go into our community colleges in the state are in need of some sort of remediation, whether that's math or English. And about 55% of Latinos, a little over half of Latinos that are going into our CSU system, are also in need of remediation. This is a huge problem in California, and I know it's a problem in the rest of the country. But what we know is that when students get into, especially at our community colleges, get into remedial education, only 20% are ever likely to come out of that and make it into a college level math or English. So when we've got 80% of Latinos coming in, testing as remedial and knowing only 20% of them will be successful, we're losing a whole chunk of students that could be degree earners or certificate earners. So we're going to be working at our state level with some dollars that are specifically for basic skills work and remediation efforts to make sure that those dollars are actually targeted at things we know work. So one is making sure that colleges are thinking differently about assessment. We know that our assessments are not perfect. We have got a high stakes test that students have to take that they don't prepare for because they don't know that they need to prepare for. There aren't books for them to prepare. There's no crash course at your college to help you prepare for this. So just kind of one day, you might be 25 years old, you might be 30, you show up at campus and you take a class that's got some basic geometry. I know I would fail that test. And then you're placed 4 levels below college level math, and who wants to do that? That's quite discouraging. And so we want to see hybrid approaches to assessment where you could have a test, but let's also look at how that student might have performed in high school. What were their grades in math and English? What was their overall GPA? Was there any work experience that might help better assess and place that student more effectively? And we're looking at a lot of community colleges that are starting to do that in California, but that needs to be scaled and it needs to be incentivized with state resources. We're also looking at acceleration efforts in the state and incentivizing those as well. We know that it doesn't take 4 years or 5 years to remediate a student. Data shows it takes 1.5 years. We should be aiming for 1.5 years, not 4.5 years. We're working on a lot of other things. I think I'll end with sharing that one of our other big efforts is we're working on a bill, SB 15, with our Senate Pro Tem in the state, Kevin DeLeon, and Senator Marty Block, to really incentivize on-time completion at our CSU, so using new revenues to make sure that students know that 15 units is full-time attendance, and when you take 15 units a semester, you will graduate in In 4 years, students are advised many times that 12 units is full-time, and if you're taking 12 units, you will never graduate in 4 years. It just will not happen. And so these are some efforts to ensure that students know that 15 units is full-time, will get you out in 4 years, and how can we give you some grant assistance and incentivize you, thinking about what the state levers are, incentivize students and give them the resources they need to maybe be able to take the 15 units per semester. Also looking at, within that legislation, ensuring that we're expanding the financial aid that our students need, expanding our Cal Grant program to low-income students. When students aren't traditional, as Deborah shared, when students aren't 2 years right out of high school, in our state, they automatically become only eligible for a pot of Cal Grant dollars that are competitive. And so there are less of them, and there are not enough to serve all the students that need to access those dollars. So how can we expand the amounts of those awards? How do we make sure community college students also actually have the funding that they need to be successful? Our CSU students and our UC students receive dollars not just for their tuition, but receive dollars to live on campus, cost of living. A community college student doesn't receive those same dollars. The students get a Board of Governors fee waiver for the very, very low fee that it costs for a student to go to a community college in California, but none of their living expenses are covered by that. And these are, again, arguably the students who need those resources the most. So how will they ever be able to attend full-time if they aren't getting supplemental resources to help them maybe only work half-time and go to school the rest of the time? So we're working on a lot more things, but I will end there. Thank you. I look forward to a rich dialogue with all of you.
Thank you, Audrey. I'm going to pass to Luis, but first let me just cover, sorry, some of what Audrey covered, and there are a lot of, the campaign is very, very active, but she touched on remediation, she touched on college preparation, you talked very much about transfer, and some of these are successes and some of these are in progress. These are some of the categories in policy that we were talking about are important at the national level and at the state level, and they also have a lot of work going on affordability. So I just want to reinforce that as we tried to find a way to frame this, you gave us some really concrete examples of the kinds of state policies and strategies that an organization like yours can really make a difference in and serve Latino students. So thank you, Audrey. With that, I'd like to pass it to Luis and your work in Colorado.
Good afternoon. Luis Torres. I'm from There. Start again. Good afternoon. I'm Luis Torres. I'm from Metropolitan State University of Denver. Actually born, bred in Colorado, so I grew up not very far from there. But it was deja vu because I taught in a community college in California. I started my professor career in a community college in California, in the San Jose area, and then at Cal State University in San Luis Obispo. So I've been gone from there for a long time, but I was reminiscing about California. Yes, that's right. And I really want to thank Excelencia in Education for arranging this, and more so for the at least 10 years of real advocacy in this immensely significant area. And we use, in Colorado, we use the information that they provide on their website. I mean, it's more than a website. It's a huge compendium of information, so it is extremely significant. A colleague was just talking to the director of Western Interstate Commission on Higher Education, David Lunkenacre, and he mentioned information. He suggested that we go to Excelencia in Education's website for information. I said, I know. So yes, thank you very much. So I thought I would focus on a few efforts in Colorado, some things that we think are progressing and some things that are not. And the first item would be funding in Colorado higher education. Deborah mentioned a bit ago that the institutions that need funding the most often are the ones that have it the least. That's almost a quotation from, it's at least a paraphrase of some of what we have been saying in Colorado, that in Colorado it is almost directly inversely proportional where the funding goes to where the Latino and the African American students are, whether that is in community colleges or in four-year institutions. In fact, a few of us did a study approximately a year and a half ago, to document this, and then we were able to use that information quite readily as the year progressed. And what I want to specifically talk about in terms of the funding, although it is just one example, is a recent piece of legislation, HB, which simply means House Bill 1319, and it was introduced last year. And this was important because in the Colorado Higher Education Master Plan, you mentioned about the master plan or lack of it in California. Colorado's Higher Education Master Plan is called simply Colorado Competes. And it was developed in 2010, and it's in constant progress of trying to update it. And that information, calls for, of course, the better education of underrepresented minorities, and in Colorado that means Latinos, African Americans, and Native Americans, is simply statistical definition. Even back then, it was indicated, and as Deborah mentioned, if you take a look at this information, you'll see that the Latino degree attainment in Colorado is roughly comparable to California and Texas. However, the overall degree attainment is higher. And we have one of the largest attainment gaps in the country, despite the fact that Colorado has one of the 3 or 4, maybe 5 most highly educated adult populations in the country. So this paradox, and that's what it's often called, Colorado paradox, we've been working on that for quite some time. And when we started discussing in Colorado, when the state legislature started discussing this higher education funding bill, one of the purposes was to try to deal with this attainment gap. And I mean, there was a lot of discussion, a lot of going back and forth. I want to emphasize the involvement of some of the community organizations, because I think that was very important in helping Colorado establish in that funding mechanism a better situation for the underrepresented minorities. For example, COSEAL, which has been mentioned, Colorado Coalition for the Educational Advancement of Latinos, the NAACP, the Colorado Black Roundtable, which is a consortium of African American organizations. And I think one of the best things that happened was this consortium, this working together very closely in meetings such as this between and among Latinos and African Americans. And CLADO, I'm not sure I mentioned that, Colorado Latino Leadership Advocacy and Research Organization. So we presented some information to the legislature, people in the legislature, to the Colorado Department of Higher Education, the Colorado Commission on Higher Education, and so on, about this funding bill. And what we kept arguing was that we needed an actual demonstration in the funding that this inequity in funding would be addressed, at least a precedent for addressing. And finally, there was what was called a 5% carve-out, that's the term, a carve-out, which would go to higher education institutions specifically for improvements in education for the underrepresented minorities, Latinos, African Americans, and Native Americans. So that was a step in the right direction, I think, a precedent. And we mentioned that while it's a small percentage, in fact, it's a 5% of what's called the College Opportunity Fund, which is the funding that goes to higher education institutions in Colorado. Well, we thought that was a relatively small portion. Also, a 10% increase for Pell Grant students. If one of the underrepresented minorities happens to be Pell, and a lot of them are, it will result in a 15% increase in funding. So that was one of the steps that we think is important, is significant, at least again as a precedent. And to reiterate, I think that the fact that these organizations got together and really worked on this was quite important. And I think, and we keep discussing in Colorado this funding gap. I've used a phrase which might sound harsh, but I think it's important. I think nationally we should ask ourselves, how much is a Latino worth in higher education? In other words, how much funding typically goes to an average Latino compared with an average white person, white student? And in Colorado, that math that we did, the statistics that we were able to show was really quite dramatic. Like I said, an inverse proportion. And I think if we could figure that out nationally, I think that would help us out locally also, and vice versa. Another point I wanted to make was the in-state tuition for undocumented students. In Colorado, it took us 10 years to pass the Colorado version of the DREAM Act. In Colorado, it's called ASSET, A-S-S-E-T, of course, it's an acronym. Advancing Students for a Stronger Economy Tomorrow. I learned that specifically for this presentation, and I'm going to forget it as of tomorrow. Those acronyms, are very, very clever, I think. But that's what it's called, Advancing Students for a Stronger Economy Tomorrow. It was first introduced, the version of the DREAM Act was first introduced in Colorado in 2003. I happen to be from Metropolitan State University. A lot of people supported it, but I have to say Metro State was one of the first to support it, especially our faculty senate, which I've always been thankful for. After 2003, when it was first introduced, and then it was introduced again in 2004, Colorado, the legislature, unfortunately, passed a very restrictive anti-immigration bill. In fact, it was considered one of the 2 or 3 most strident or stringent anti-immigration bills in the country. It was 2006 1023, 1023, House Bill 06, which simply means 2006 1023. And it stated that no public benefit, that was the crucial term, no public benefit would be granted to undocumented immigrants. And that was taken to mean in higher education, that higher education was a public benefit, that in-state tuition was a public benefit. And therefore it was considered to be illegal according to 1023. So we went from introducing it in 2003 to this restrictive bill in 2006. It didn't pass finally until 2013. Now that's a long time. That was 10 years of constant struggle by the organizations I just mentioned, by a lot of other organizations, a lot of other effort. And I want to point this out, this next point, because I think it is very important in states that do not have the DREAM Act or a version of our asset bill. Let's go back to the DREAM Act. My institution, Metropolitan State University, on its own, developed a separate tuition rate for undocumented students. Today, there are approximately 16 states, I think, 16 states that provide a version of the DREAM Act. Well, that means most states do not have a version of the DREAM Act. And I think it might be possible for institutions in other states to do what we did at the university. So we developed our own tuition rate. It takes much too long to try to explain how. We studied the Colorado laws, the federal laws. We studied a lot of different, in a lot of different ways. We kept trying to figure out how we could do this on our own, and we finally did it in 2012. In 2012, the university created its own tuition rate, more than in-state, in order to make sure that there wasn't a readily identifiable benefit, public benefit, and yet vastly less than out of state. It was about 40% of what out of state would have been. So that it was previously really restrictive to the undocumented populations. They simply couldn't attend. Within a year after we did that, then Colorado passed, and I think the higher education community realized, there was a very positive thing. So then the asset bill, once again, our version of the DREAM Act, was passed by the legislature the following year. So if it might be possible for other states to do that, I would really, really suggest it. Two other quick things in about a minute. One thing that we do that I think is very significant is concurrent enrollment between high schools and colleges and universities. It has really played a very positive influence on recruitment, for one thing, that the students learn in high school, that they can take higher education courses paying at the community college rate. Actually, they do not pay the community college rate. The high schools themselves pay the institutions. So essentially, students can get up to 12 credits, 12 college or university credits through being involved in concurrent enrollment. And finally, alternatives to remediation education. In Colorado, there's a bill called the Massey Bill, M-A-S-S-E-Y, passed in 2012, to change remedial education. Previously, students would test into, for example, English 030, 060, or 090, possibly have to take all three of those before they would be able to get into English 1010. I'm an old English professor, by the way. And those three remedial education courses, of course, would not count for college education. A student might come into my class, and I would have to send them to a community college. If a student comes into my class, I'm responsible for that student. So we wanted to be able to develop a way in Colorado to have what we called stretch English. I'm not sure which other states might do this, but stretch English 1010, for example, where the students take a 2-semester course but get 6 hours of credit, 6 hours of university credit, in order to fulfill what previously we would have called remedial education, and then fulfill the English 1010 version. There are other items that I'd like to bring up when we're discussing, but at least those 4 items I wanted to introduce as to what we are doing in Colorado.
Thank you, Luis, and thank you also, Audrey. I think the hard part for us is that because we really are engaged respectively at our state levels and others and constantly use a Latino lens, it's hard to pick like what are the 2 or 3 things we really want to focus on, because everything we see is relevant to Latinos, especially in these states. So thank you for trying to restrain a little bit in how we approach this. We covered funding, transfer, financial aid and affordability, capacity, remediation, undocumented students, concurrent enrollment. All are critical, and they were all within the profile of what we were looking at in state policy. For you all, given what you've heard, which is just a sampling, and we have more detail that you can follow up on, are there components in state policy that you see are missing or that we really should be highlighting in the work you're doing for consideration? And or are there things in state policy that you think can be translated to federal policy in a more significant way than we're currently doing? I posited that out there, but if there are other questions, I'd love to hear them as well. So yeah, you should feel free. Please, just your name so that we know who you are, and then your question. Yes. I think great question. I think just as when we look at effective practice, not everything can be translated or scaled up at bigger scale. The same way here. Part of what we were trying to get at is figuring out if transfer is such a critical issue across states, is there a federal role in doing so? I think, yes, it doesn't mean scale up what they're doing in California, but what was interesting is that they applied pressure using state policy. And this is applicable, as you know, with the Higher Ed Act at the federal level, to ensure that there is an articulated pathway and it's incentivized. Now, what they can do, which we can't do at the federal level, is to mandate that every institution that gets a student with an AA in front of them is able to transfer. You can't require that.
A couple of things that I didn't mention that are really is important statewide work that we're doing, but also I think has some federal we can use federal support, I think, are around financial aid. So first is, mandatory. We think mandatory FAFSA completion. We know that when students fill out the FAFSA, that they're 50% more likely to enroll in college than if they didn't fill it out. In California, we have students who have the right GPA, take the right sequence of courses, because we have to have certain sequence of courses to make students eligible for our four-year university systems. They do all that, but if they don't complete that FAFSA, they don't go to college. And part of it is because they don't receive the money that they need to pay for it. But second, it's just overcoming that prevailing thought that so many students have that I cannot possibly afford college. And so I think, we look to the federal government to say, how can we, if we're slow as a state, how can we get incentivized by the federal government to get FAFSA completion done? Or how can we have every student in this country fill out the FAFSA form? The second thing that we're really committed to is making sure that students know about income-based repayment programs when they graduate. That's highly important. Again, alleviating students' fear of taking on student debt, good student debt, when they're in college, and not becoming so burdened when they graduate that they can't, move on to another job, or they're living at home and they never can buy a car, and all those things that we know happen. Too few students we know in California and across the state are taking advantage of income-based repayment programs. How do we make that not optional? How do we make the default an opt-out instead of an opt-in? One of the things we always talk about in higher education is that students don't do optional. We don't do optional. If I have an optional survey to fill out or something that's optional, chances are I'm not going to do it. But if we make things defaults and you have to opt out of being reviewed for being in an income-based repayment program, wow, wouldn't we have a lot more students that could take advantage of that? So those are just two quick things that where we think the feds can have a big role.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll go back to the first item that I mentioned, and that is, what kind of funding do the institutions have? Financial aid is one part, that's to the student, but what kind of finances do the institutions have in order to serve those students? And the discrepancies are absolutely enormous. You take, again, what we did was we just figured out which state, which institutions the least number of minorities went to, and you could bet on a scale of 2 or 3 times what the other institutions did, and that's not even considering community colleges. These are four-year institutions. If one institution has, 3 times the amount of funding per student as another, think of the services, the wraparound services that one institution can provide: advising, counseling, supplemental academic instruction, and so on, class sizes, versus the other institution. I don't know what the federal government could do in that regard. Certainly I think that the federal government could be helpful in making certain that the institutions that need the funding the most in order to educate the students who need the education the most.
Luis, that's kind of what the support for Title V and Hispanic serving institutions. You have high enrollment needy students, low educational general expenditures. You've got some of those components, right?
Yes, but the HSI funding is approximately 104 million, 105 million for the entire country, right? For a population of about 50 million, yeah. 50 million Latinos, that's about, well, you can do the math, $2 or so. So at any rate, the funding, I think, to the institutions that serve the students who need education the most, I know that would really assist, I think, Latino education completion, because, again, it's very simple. I'm an administrator now. I don't know if I mentioned that. And I know how much money is needed to serve one student who needs remedial education, for example, and the advising and the counseling that goes with that. So that funding is extremely important.
Let me give you 2 more. There's a federal role in looking at the metrics. So you look at transfers, and we all know what graduation rates don't include. And there is a federal role here in articulating that. We measure what we value what we measure. So there is a federal role here in making sure that looking at part-time students and transfer students, we have a way to track them to completion. Because if they are students who are not, we don't pay attention to an institutional investment and support, they're not invested in. That's a clear federal role in making sure we've got commensurate cohorts, and there are lots of efforts I know to do that, but so metrics do matter. The other is, and one of the things that's made Virginia successful in being able to have an effective transfer component is that, initially at least, they tried to incentivize students to complete their associate degree at the community college so that they then could get kind of a discount, a scholarship to help subsidize the cost at a 4-year that was more expensive. So there is an instrument there of strategy that can incentivize students and incentivize institutions to support students. We don't take a look at institutions that have high transfer rates. In fact, they have very poor graduation rates because they've adapted their services to adapt to their transfer students, and they don't get credit in the graduation rates for it. So that recognition, if we're going to do effective federal work and transfer and articulation, we have to make sure that we're measuring it right and we're incentivizing. And there are state examples like Virginia that have done that well. Now, those things some of them come at cost. The metrics, maybe not, although agreeing to additional metrics beyond graduation rates, it's its own dance. But we did this with high school graduation rates. Right, and Senator Warner now, but when he was a governor, really paid attention to make sure, can we standardize how we define and measure graduation rates across the states, and if we could do something close to that with a transfer rate, much less including transfers in our graduation rates, that would be a very powerful impact for students who start in community colleges and need to transition, of which 46% of Latinos start in community college nationally, and Audrey gave you the numbers in California. So those are really critical federal levers, and I don't want to shy away from, I appreciate the funding challenge, but we do have a federal approach to look at institutions that have a high enrollment of needy and low educational general expenditures and to improve and support their capacity. And we have that structure of HSIs that have a critical mass of Latinos enrolled. If you want to find a way to target overtly for this population as part of the whole, looking at what we're doing for capacity building and support and those kinds of institutions, that's an existing lever. So I think those are just a couple of examples of how you could translate some of the work to make a difference.
Now, of course, I would add that, I would add that I'm trying to remember the percentage of Latino students who go to HSI is approximately 52.
60%.
Is it?
60% of Latino undergraduates.
So 40% do not.
Right.
And at the same time, so those institutions would need assistance, and at the same time, of course, increasing the funding to HSIs, which has been pretty much stalled for the last few years.
Maybe we'll have the last question. I saw Luis raise his hand appropriately enough. Yes, last question. I can tell you in California, I mean, part of our concern is that they haven't significantly invested in it. In fact, in some ways, they pulled back from the ability to do that. And so we've had to default looking at things like the National Student Clearinghouse because institutions give their data to an external nonprofit organization, and you have to basically get it from that entity because you can't get it from the state. So California has pulled back from the very thing you're talking about, which is the ability to track students at a state level. You've supported the community college chancellor to do some of this, but it's the community college. It's not what you're talking about, which is the entire state. And so there are real data challenges in tracking students with unit IDs in California. That I know for sure. Colorado? In
Colorado, we have guaranteed transfer courses. It's called GT Pathways, but we don't track the students who are transferring as you're discussing. So we have exerted quite a bit of effort to make sure that especially the general studies type courses transfer.
Right. And I would say in Texas, the biggest concern is that there's a whole bunch of issues raised about FERPA and the K-12 sharing data with higher ed and the workforce development being able to get access to either of those. So we've put up a lot of roadblocks. So in the 3 states, we've spent a lot more time and attention. We've not seen the kind of interest and political push for the unit ID to be able to track their students. So we have a lot of policy folks and researchers that cobble together strategies, but it leads for a more imprecise tracking of students.
At my institution, 60% of our students are transfers, so we're very familiar with the transfer issues.
The reason I stood up here was not to stop the questions, but more to make a comment that I think that the premise from which one of the questions came, which is to cherry pick from this conversation what's applicable to federal policy is most appropriate, given that we're here on Capitol Hill. But what we want also to underscore is that the approach that this study and this effort asserts is that this is about a long-term framework based on human capital. And so it very much links to the tactical and technical element of race ethnicity and the capacity that all of us need to safeguard to be able to measure impact with this kind of data. From our perspective, the opportunity to look at the relevance of what these two states and Texas, and I didn't know, Deborah, before we ended, if we were going to highlight anything from Texas, but these three states have done successfully, but probably even more significantly, what is hindering? Because the hindering part of what is currently active at the state level and its potential for migrating into federal discussions is the other dimension of what we would want to raise up. Did we want to say anything about Texas specifically today?
No, I think that I tried to then go across all three because I felt we were losing time. We do have specifics in each of the briefs, in the brief for each of the states that you can delve deeper in, and we hope that continues the thoughtfulness of what's happening, what more needs to happen in the states. Well, that could be some of it, but I will say part of the challenge, and again, looking at Latinos, is that we tend to be a little bit more loan averse, and we choose down institutions that are more affordable, and therefore we don't take on the debt burden, and therefore figuring out the cost is so. But that doesn't mean it isn't an important question that we should answer, so I appreciate that, yeah. I want to take one last, I think those are helpful observations. I don't want to minimize that because I do think we do want to make sure we pay attention. We've written it down as well, but I'd like the gentleman here to have the last word to your question.
What I'll share in California about that is that, as I alluded to, we're not sure our basic skills problem is actually as big as it is. We think it may be an assessment problem, that the tool that we're using to measure where our students should be placed is flawed. When we have a community college, Long Beach City College, that decided to go from just using their assessment model to using high school grades and how students performed in math and English. Students were moved, a cohort of students were moved directly into college level math and English, and at rates of about 70% were successful. Now, these are students who would have placed possibly 3 or 4 levels below college level English and math. And so I think part of the discussion in California is about what is it about our assessments or the preparation for the assessments that isn't working for the students. Maybe it's not, as in many cases, a student problem, but an institutional or tool problem. That said, in California, like the rest of the country, we're lining up, and trying to do alignment around Common Core. And so I think the hope is that our institutions, and I think we've seen a lot of proactivity in California of our community colleges, our CSUs and UCs that are working in feeder patterns with their K-12 partners to really align curriculum so that students really are coming out of high school college ready on day one.
I'll just add one point to what I mentioned earlier about the remedial education and what I call the stretch English 1010. We have that in math also, by the way. Stretch math, I guess it's 1010. The same situation as in English, where the students take 2 classes back to back 2 semesters. They also they develop a learning community. So the students in the fall semester take the same instructor for the second class, the second semester, with the same cohort of students, and that learning community seems to be helping with retention. In fact, the retention rates for the students in the stretch English 1010 and the stretch math 1010, the retention rates are higher than for the university as a whole. So it does seem to be working. One last thing, but go ahead.
No, because I'm going to wrap up, because I'm going to respond, because what we didn't answer was his question about what is K-12 doing or
That's
not
right,
doing.
yeah.
So I think Audrey helped a little bit by saying maybe it's the assessment, not the student, which addresses part of it, but we don't want to negate. The question really is that K-12, is it not doing its job, that we even have a need to assess and find remediation. I do think we are here more in higher ed capacity, but I don't think we can negate that, we've seen a preponderance of constrained resources, qualified teachers, expectation levels being low, the kind of efforts that really challenge students who have the potential of doing so well academically being shut out or turning away from academics as an opportunity because of their K-12 experience. I think that's a critical question and probably a conversation for another day, because I think unpacking the challenges of K-12 and Latinos in them is an absolutely critical conversation for us to have, and it's beyond, I think, the scope of this, though.
I want to add one additional point. By the way, when my colleagues in higher education criticize K through 12, I point out to them that every single teacher came out of higher ed. It's their own students who become those teachers. I wanted to have a chance to just mention about multicultural education in K through 12. In Colorado, we have a bill. Here's the number: Title 22, Article 1, Section 104, that states that, and I'm going to read just a bit of it: the teaching of history, culture, and civil government. The history and civil government of the state of Colorado shall be taught in all the public schools of this state, which would say, okay. In addition, the history and civil government of the United States, which includes the history, culture, and contributions of minorities, including but not limited to the American Indians, Hispanic Americans, and the African Americans, shall be taught in all the public schools of this state. So that's an actual bill in Colorado. I know that in California there are some school districts that are doing that. In other words, teaching the history, culture, contributions, what in higher ed we would call, Chicano and Chicano studies, African American studies, and so on. And that is an effort that the same groups that I was mentioning earlier, COSIL, GLADO, NAACP, Black Roundtable, and so on, we are trying to figure out how to get a statewide movement going, similar to how the Common Core was introduced in different states, so that there would be statewide efforts to really implement this. It's been on the books for a while, but it hasn't been implemented like it should have been. But I think that would, back to your question about K through 12, I think those kinds of programs have been very important in higher education. And we think that in K through 12, that would be very significant.
Great.
Last question?
Good.
Last
Okay.
comment?
No, I would say please follow up with us if you want to engage more in this conversation. The good thing is we've got partners like these here in Educate Texas that are really focused on this with a level of detail that's hard to capture in a little bit over an hour. But what I appreciate is that we're all leveraging each other's work. And so when the campaign is working on efforts, we're paying attention to what they're pushing, what their policy priorities are, trying to see how we can translate it and or find ways to support it, and the same with Colorado and vice versa. And I think paying attention to a Latino lens of strategies and public policy is really important, and framing it in a manner that doesn't negate others, but also doesn't apologize for making sure Latinos are included in the discourse and dialogue, and that they're benefiting from the strategies and efforts that, or not, and we call that out and hold accountable, is really the value added of these kinds of leverages and partnerships. So thank you for taking your time and being here with us. Thank you for thinking through this and being advocates and supporters. And please engage in this conversation more so we can inform public policy. Thank you.
Going forward, Ensuring America's Future will be releasing this brief the week of March 9th. Not only will the brief and the executive summary of this discussion be made available, the video of the whole event, but more importantly, by your presence here today, this is really the ongoing work that we will engage in. If there are direct strategies that you want to learn more about, seize the moment while our fine colleagues are here in town. But more importantly, that you can count on this conversation, this framework, and this strategy of benchmarking any innovation, whether it be federal policy, state policy, institutional policy, against its ability to accelerate Latino student success. That's the drumbeat. that we move by, and it is the accountability measure that we are going to assert as we go forward. We don't talk about demographics over here and our practices and policies over here. They have to be brought together. If that's a conversation that's part of your work, we're here to work with you. Thank you for joining us.